we carefully examine a capitalist system, we will see that it's based on exploitation, because the viciousness of capitalism, and the reason why once black people examine it, we can never be for it, is that under a capitalist system, the fruits of those who labor are enjoyed by somebody else. That is, those who do the laboring, the fruits of their labor, they don't enjoy it. As a matter of fact, we could say under capitalism that the fruits of the labor of the toiling masses are enjoyed by those who do not labor. And now people get confused because this is a capitalist system and it's a developed system. It's a technological system. So they combine capitalism with technology and development, and they think that there is no other possible way to develop this rapid terms of development without going through the capitalist route. But certainly we have examples that show the opposite of that. China is a clear example of that. Cuba is, North Korea, North Vietnam. These countries certainly in Africa, where countries have chosen the socialist path, such as Tanzania, Guinea, Congo, Brazzaville, Algeria, we see that there is another way to develop and get the same type of things that we have under the capitalist system, but in a system that does not exploit each other.
Few turning points in U.S. history are as stark as the Civil War. The U.S. before the Civil War was a land of slave labor in the South and small-scale manufacturing in the North. The U.S. after the Civil War was a land of wage labor and large factories. The Industrial Revolution. A popular slogan before the Civil War was free land, free soil, free labor. It was a vision for a United States of America without slavery, one where every man would be able to work for himself and support his family off the fruits of his own labor. This included both farmers and manufacturers. People who worked in manufacturing before the Civil War worked in small shops in northern cities. There would be a boss or owner, but usually that boss or owner worked alongside his employees. Workers had control over their working conditions and hours. They had the freedom to do their jobs the way they wanted to do them. This was the essence of free labor, and it became an accepted part of what it meant to be free in the United States at the time. It was a marked contrast to the misery of slavery that dominated the South, where human beings were treated as property and plantation owners reaped all of the profits. When slavery was eradicated after the Civil War, most people assumed that this meant free labor would reign. Yet, 25 years after the war, it was clear that free labor did not reign. What happened? This video will outline the struggles of labor to remain free after the Civil War, when the Industrial Revolution took the country by storm. The small-scale manufacturing that dominated the North before the Civil War gave way to large factories after the Civil War. These factories supplied the new large entities of the era, the railroads. Railroads needed steel and coal. Only large factories and mines could supply the steel and coal needed to fuel a nationwide rail system. This nationwide rail system was underwritten by the government. The government gave land grants out west to rail companies for every mile of track they built. Much of this land went through desolate Native American territory. But this territory did not stay desolate or Native American for very long. The Homestead Act gave land out west to American settlers who could make improvements. The West filled up quickly with white settlers from the East. This increased the value of the land owned by the rail companies, making them the wealthiest entities in the country practically overnight. They were no longer merely companies, they were modern corporations. Corporations have always existed in some form in the United States. The documentary, The Corporation, explains what early corporations were like.
The dominant role of corporations in our lives is essentially a product of roughly the past century. Corporations were originally associations of people who were chartered by a state to perform some particular function, like a group of people want to build a bridge over the Charles River or something like that.
In both the law and the culture, the corporation was considered a subordinate entity that was a gift from the people in order to serve the public good. So you have that history, and we shouldn't be misled by it. It's not as if those were the halcyon days when all corporations served the public trust. But there's a lot to learn from that.
This is how the rail companies started out. However, they became very different from the early types of corporations. Rail corporations were nationwide entities who needed to coordinate over long distances. Their sheer size meant they needed money and organization far beyond any corporation that existed before. The government land they received meant that rail wasn't their only business. They were in real estate too. If that real estate also had coal and iron, they were in mining on top of that. And most importantly, they could sell paper stock. In fact, rail was often the least important aspect of many rail corporations. This was just the tip of the iceberg. Big rail corporations needed to be supplied by big steel and big coal producers, who also took the form of corporations. Andrew Carnegie rode the waves of the new economy to become something new in American history: a millionaire. As a young man, Carnegie worked as a telegraph operator on the Pennsylvania Railroad, owned by the notorious Tom Scott. The story goes that Scott invested a part of Carnegie's paycheck in stocks. Carnegie made more money from the investments than he ever could earning a salary from work. The lesson was clear. Work was for suckers. Instead of being a railroad worker, he took steps to become an owner in steel refining. Carnegie was always on the lookout for the latest machines that could produce steel cheap and efficiently. These machines needed lots of space and lots of workers in places that we would call factories today. Steam power allowed corporations to build factories anywhere, particularly in cities like Pittsburgh or Chicago. The factory system changed the way Americans work. The idea of free labor assumed people would work in small shops alongside their bosses where they would control their working hours and conditions. There was no room for this in the factory system. Factories employed large numbers of people who worked according to strict schedules and conditions over which they had no control. Their bosses, like Carnegie, did not work alongside them. The bosses didn't do any physical labor at all. There was now a separation between workers and bosses in both physical and social space. Bosses were the ones who made the rules and set the wages for factory workers. They were also the ones who pocketed the profits. They were no longer merely bosses. They were capitalists, an entirely distinct social class from their workers. By the 1870s, most workers in the city of Chicago were employed in places with 50 or more people. In other words, most workers were in factories owned by capitalists. The size and speed of the machines meant that the pace of work was furious. It was common for people to work between 12 and 16 hours a day, including weekends. Even the small shops that still existed had to operate for long hours just to compete with the factories. This led to worker fatigue, which led to many workplace injuries. In 1867, the city of Chicago passed some of the first 8-hour workday laws in the country. Unfortunately, most workplaces did not observe these laws. People continued to work long, dangerous hours. It is important to note that the 8-hour day was not some random number. 8 hours is exactly a third of the entire day. As the old saying went, 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will. It was the what we will part that was important. For most of U.S. history, workers considered working for a wage to be a temporary thing. Free labor entailed that you worked for a wage part of the time and trained to be a boss or an owner at other parts. Working for a wage was just a step people took on the road to success. The 8-hour day was supposed to allow people to pursue this vision of success. The owners and capitalists of Chicago did not see things this way. They believed limiting their workers to 8 hours a day would hurt their businesses, since they would be forced to compete with other businesses in other cities that did not have 8-hour days. They ignored Chicago's 8-hour day law, and there wasn't much the city could do to enforce it. But maybe there was something the workers could do. They banded together into some of the earliest examples of industrial labor unions. Unions tried to unite everyone who worked in the same industry. Soon, many of these unions united with each other to create the Chicago Trades and Labor Assembly, the CTLA, a kind of super union. In 1867, CTLA workers took the day off work to come into the streets to protest for the 8-hour day. In other words, they went on strike. The city responded by bringing the police out to break up the strike. This would become a common theme throughout the Industrial Revolution. Government using armed force to protect owners against workers. The strike failed. The age of free labor was disappearing. Owners did not share the struggles of their workers the way they used to. Workers did not have control over their hours or conditions like they used to. And, above all, the government would be there to put their thumbs on the scales to help the owners. Many labor battles would be fought in Chicago. Others would be fought in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was turning out to be a major coal-producing region of the United States. Pennsylvania had anthracite coal, which was considered much better quality than the bituminous coal found in more western states. Anthracite coal was used to heat homes and power machines. It was becoming an integral part of the Industrial Revolution. Most of the anthracite coal mines in Pennsylvania were controlled by small companies. These small companies were sort of throwbacks to the era of free labor. Workers were able to control how and how long they worked. Owners saw themselves as part of the workforce more than they saw themselves as capitalists. Having so many small companies mine coal under such varied conditions meant that some years they produced a lot of coal and other years they produced a little. This fluctuation in coal supply meant that prices fluctuated as well. When prices went down, workers saw their wages cut. The workers formed the Workingmen's Benevolent Association, the WBA, a union that tried to negotiate more stable wages with the owners. The WBA and the owners found an uneasy equilibrium by the 1870s. But that equilibrium was about to be thrown off because the coal industry was about to get a new competitor, the Pennsylvania Railroad. Tom Scott, the owner of the Pennsylvania Railroad, did not want to be left out of the anthracite coal boom. He established coal mines throughout Pennsylvania or bought existing mines from the smaller owners who were there already. Most of the workers he employed were already part of the WBA. Scott soon discovered that the smaller coal companies were making his life more difficult. The rise and fall of coal production affected the prices of all coal, including the coal he sold. This did not sit well with Scott, who was used to running businesses that had predictable profits. He made an agreement with the other major coal producers in other states to fix the price of coal at a certain stable amount. This was one of the first examples of a cartel, which is when different businesses work behind the scenes to set prices and supplies. The cartel worked well enough until the mid-1870s, but then, in 1873, the United States faced its first widespread economic depression. A depression is when businesses go under and workers lose jobs. Those workers can't buy goods or pay rent, which causes other businesses to go under, causing more workers to lose jobs, which causes more businesses to go under. It is a cycle of economic misery, one which the country had never really faced before. When giant nationwide corporations run the economy, giant nationwide economic misery takes place when those corporations run into problems. Depressions were a consequence of the Industrial Revolution. This was such a new problem that a word didn't even exist for it yet. People called it the Panic of 1873. But we would term it as a depression today. The Panic of 1873 hit the Pennsylvania Railroad's coal business hard. They cut the wages of their WBA workers. The WBA workers went on strike. The railroad was prepared to play hardball. Tom Scott was allied with most of Pennsylvania's major newspapers. He had the newspapers run stories that would label the WBA as something that would strike fear into the hearts of most Americans. Molly Maguires. The Molly Maguires were a secret organization from Ireland that fought against the power of British landlords. Calling someone a Molly Maguire had all sorts of negative connotations. It meant they were foreigners. It meant they were secretive. It meant they were violent. In a word, it was like calling someone a terrorist today. Newspapers pinned unsolved murders in Pennsylvania to the Molly Maguires and pinned the Molly Maguires to the WBA. For good measure, the Pennsylvania Railroad also tried to produce proof of their accusations. They hired private detective agencies to infiltrate the WBA. The most well-known agency was called the Pinkertons, a company that provided security to President Lincoln before the days of the Secret Service. When the Pinkertons couldn't find any proof that the WBA and the Molly Maguires were the same, they encouraged the WBA to do terrorist acts. If that didn't work, they would just make stuff up. Thanks to the work of the Pinkertons and the newspapers, many WBA leaders were brought to trial and imprisoned. Most of these cases had no evidence aside from the stuff fabricated by the Pinkertons or made up by the newspapers. In fact, the WBA kicked out any member that had a criminal record. It didn't matter. The WBA was broken by the late 1870s. Their leaders were in prison. The Pennsylvania Railroad had won. Why was the railroad able to get away with this? First and foremost, they were capitalists with access to immense resources. They could pay off newspapers, politicians, and police. Second, they played on that good old-fashioned American racism. Painting someone as a Molly Maguire in 1870s Pennsylvania was like painting someone as Al-Qaeda, Hamas, or Hezbollah today. It meant they were dangerous, irrational people. Above all, it meant they were foreign. Many Pennsylvania coal miners were Irish, so people were prepared to believe racist stereotypes about them. Why did the WBA go on strike? Because it was a plot by Irish terrorists to destroy America. We see the same thing today. Why do migrants come over the border from Mexico? Because Latin American governments empty their jails and send them over here in an attempt to destroy America. Today, we even have the added nugget of the Great Replacement Theory, which says that Jews are actually sending Hispanics over to America in order to destroy the beautifully pure white population of the United States. Indeed, one of Elon Musk's favorite topics to tweet about on X is Great Replacement propaganda. A network of rich people, racists, and media owners can always be counted on to beat down on the most desperate people, whether we're talking about the 1870s or the 2020s. Desperate people were coming to America in droves during the late 1800s. They were coming from Ireland, Germany, Italy, and other areas of southern and eastern Europe. America's Industrial Revolution was pulling them into the country. It was also pushing them out of their countries. The Homestead Act increased the amount of farmland in the United States. The Industrial Revolution produced machines, like the mechanical reaper, that increased how much food that land produced. The US sold this food on the world market, causing food prices to plunge throughout the late 1800s. This made it impossible for peasant farmers in Europe to earn enough money to survive. Many of them left their farms to come to America for factory jobs. And they received the full American experience: racism, xenophobia, economic depression, and the power of capitalists. We saw earlier that Tom Scott created a coal cartel. But what kind of capitalist would he be if he also didn't make a rail cartel? The Eastern Trunk Lines Association was Tom Scott's cartel to regulate rail rates in the Northeast. It ensured a steady stream of profits to his Pennsylvania Railroad, which ensured a steady stream of profits to anyone who held Pennsylvania Railroad stock. Scott saw to it that his stockholders would always make money. After all, happy stockholders rarely ask questions. He did not need a bunch of angry stockholders questioning his practices, many of which may not have been totally legal or ethical. As long as the stockholders made 10% of their investments, they would be happy, which made Tom Scott happy. Unfortunately, there were times when it was tough for Scott to ensure a 10% rate of return while also paying his workers properly. The Depression of 1873 forced Scott to make a choice: reduce what he paid his stockholders or cut wages. It was an easy choice. Between 1873 and 1877, Scott continually cut his workers' wages. Many of his workers saw a 30% decrease in wages. He did other things to save money too, like deadheading. Deadheading is when rail workers were required to sit around and wait for an assignment without getting paid. They were often required to wait in cities in which they did not live for jobs that never came. Needless to say, Workers on deadhead duty did not get paid unless they were called to work. Deadheading took workers away from their families and prevented them from finding other work for which they could get paid. It was a slap in the face to the idea of free labor. Not only did it make it tough for workers to feed their families, it demonstrated how little control they had over their working conditions. Once Tom Scott cut wages and instituted deadheading, every other Eastern Trunk Rail company did the same. Thousands of workers had to deal with low or non-existent pay in the midst of an economic depression. In 1877, workers on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad in Camden, Maryland walked off their jobs in protest. News of the strike spread instantly over rail and telegraph wires. When news reached the workers in Martinsburg, West Virginia, they walked off the job in solidarity. Martinsburg was a major rail hub where many different lines operated. Shutting it down brought the entire Northeast's rail system to its knees. The Great Strike of 1877 had begun. Martinsburg, Baltimore, Pittsburgh, St. Louis, and Chicago would all see major strikes. It had the feeling of a revolution. Workers were joined by their families and anyone else who was sick of the power of the railroads. Railroads had taken over every aspect of American life. They ran through American streets. Railroad accidents were a leading cause of death in the United States. Most working people had some sort of bone to pick with the rail companies, and this was their chance to fight back. This was a nightmare for Tom Scott. He demanded the government take action. The governor of West Virginia called the militia out to Martinsburg to break the strike and help operate the trains. A worker fired at a militiaman. The militiaman fired back and killed the worker. After that, the militia refused to break the strike. Not only did they fear the crowd, many militiamen sympathized with the crowd. They were workers too, after all. The people they were supposed to fire on were their friends and neighbors. Rail owners then turned to the federal government, asking President Rutherford B. Hayes to send out American troops. This went against the age-old American fear of standing armies and how they could be used to crack down on civil rights. After some hesitation, Hayes half-heartedly agreed to send troops to trouble areas, pulling them out of the South at that very moment thanks to the end of Reconstruction. In Terre Haute, Indiana, a worker leader named Eugene V. Debs tried to prevent his fellow workers from striking. He did not see the small rail company of Terre Haute as an evil corporation. He saw them as fellow workers and tried to convince the company to join the workers in a protest against the real enemy, the Pennsylvania Railroad and Tom Scott himself. The rail owners in Terre Haute were not buying it. They convinced the governor of Indiana to call out the militia and break the strike. Debs learned that there was no unity to be had between workers and owners. The United States was dividing along class lines. Debs spent the rest of his life trying to unite the working class into a powerful force. Workers in other cities had already learned that lesson. In cities like St. Louis, workers from all backgrounds united. German, Italian, Polish, and African American. Same thing in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where the power of the Pennsylvania Railroad was greatest. In Chicago, the center of America's rail system, workers of all backgrounds took over the streets. This was scary to the respectable middle and wealthy classes. It reminded them of the Paris Commune. Back in 1871, in the city of Paris, France, poor soldiers took over the city after France's loss in the Franco-Prussian War. They started passing laws that gave working people power. This was called the Paris Commune. Commune, as in communism. Communism had become popular in Europe during the mid to late 1800s. Its most well-known proponent was the German Jewish philosopher Karl Marx. He called for the abolition of private property and for the working classes to rise up and take control of the means of production from the capitalists. The people of the Paris Commune had started to do this in 1871 until the French army put a stop to it. Now it looked like the same thing was happening in the United States. To wealthy, native-born Americans, it looked like immigrant workers brought the idea of communism across the ocean with them. In Pittsburgh, the governor of Pennsylvania took bold action. He knew he couldn't trust the Pittsburgh militia to come out and break the protest. That didn't work in Martinsburg, West Virginia. Instead, he called the militia out of Philadelphia, a city all the way on the other side of the state. The Philadelphia militia wouldn't know the protesters in Pittsburgh and wouldn't have much of a problem using violence on them if necessary. Bloody battles broke out on the streets of Pittsburgh. The protesters burned down 3 miles worth of Pennsylvania Railroad property. It seemed that there was no way for the upper classes to shoot their way out of this problem. Fortunately for them, they wouldn't have to. The tried and true American values of racism and xenophobia would do it for them. In San Francisco, an organization called the Working Men's Party had trouble uniting all of the workers. There was one group of workers with whom the others did not want to work: the Chinese. Rail companies had been importing workers from China for years under labor contracts. Workers in the United States tended to see Chinese workers as tools of rail companies, brought in to drive wages down. Instead of focusing their venom on rail companies, workers in San Francisco went into Chinese neighborhoods to harass the people there. They organized boycotts of Chinese products and made agreements with small business owners to not hire Chinese workers. In St. Louis, the Working Men's Party united black workers into a coalition with European immigrant workers. It seemed as if they were on the verge of taking over the city like the Paris Commune. But at the height of their power, they fell apart. Without clear leadership, they were unable to make clear demands. They quite simply couldn't decide on what they wanted now that they had the power to get it. They fell back on the old demands for an 8-hour day because it was one of the few things everyone could agree on. However, some of the native-born white workers did not want to have the same privileges as black workers. It was an affront to the idea of white supremacy, of the idea that your whiteness entitles you to preferential treatment. Immigrant workers were torn between standing with their black comrades or chasing the promises of white supremacy for themselves. After all, most native-born Americans didn't consider Irish, Italians, or Poles as white. However, maybe one day these groups could be accepted into the brotherhood of whiteness. These ethnic divisions in San Francisco and St. Louis would come up many times throughout American history, preventing a true class consciousness from taking shape. Combine this with the fact that the wealthy classes certainly did have class consciousness of their own, as well as the coercive power of the state and federal governments to enforce it. And you could see why the Great Strike of 1877 failed to make any lasting changes. While it is probably true that the rail owners won the day, they didn't win everything. Tom Scott and the others had to take back the wage cuts for their workers. The strike cost them more money than just paying the workers the wages they were promised. Scott was forced instead to reduce the returns he gave to the stockholders. He slowly lost control over the Pennsylvania Railroad and ended up selling it to the oil baron, John D. Rockefeller. He suffered a series of strokes and died in 1881. Smaller businesses could not afford to survive another major strike. Many of them dealt with unions in good faith, paying decent wages, limiting hours, and giving workers a semblance of control over their conditions. So while the major capitalists certainly came out on top, workers were able to carve out a little piece for themselves when dealing with smaller businesses. It was clear that, if workers wanted to win the next strike, they would need to be united under clear leadership. Many organizations rose from the ashes of the Great Strike of 1877. The one that rose the fastest was the Knights of Labor, founded in 1869. The Knights tried to accomplish the class solidarity that had eluded workers during the strike. Men and women, black and white, native-born and immigrant, everyone who labored with their hands were welcome to join the Knights of Labor. Bankers, stockbrokers, and others who pushed paper were not allowed. Uriah Stevens was its first leader, but they did not become truly organized until Terence Powderly, the former mayor of Scranton, Pennsylvania, became leader. The Great Strike of 1877 taught Powderly that strikes were not the way to class consciousness. Instead, they wanted to use the power at the local level, electing mayors and governors who would create public works that would provide good jobs. They encouraged the creation of cooperatives, businesses owned by workers, that would obviate the need for a class of capitalists who reaped all of the profits. In this way, the Knights of Labor echoed some of the demands of European communists, although Powderly would never classify himself as such. The Knights had two major victories during the 1880s that would make them the biggest labor union in the country. The first were their efforts to stop corporations from contracting workers from foreign countries. As we saw earlier, rail companies contracted workers from China. American-born workers saw Chinese contract laborers as tools of corporations designed to break the power of the working class. The Knights accepted all immigrant groups except the Chinese for this reason. In 1882, they pressured the federal government to pass the Chinese Exclusion Act, which barred any new immigration from China. The Chinese became the only group in U.S. history to be discriminated against by name in law. It was seen as a victory for the Knights, despite the fact it only passed Congress thanks to that good old-fashioned American racism. In 1885, Congress also passed the Foreign Act, which banned contract labor from other countries. It didn't ban immigration, it merely banned companies from funding the trips of immigrant workers to the United States. However, these victories were not as important as when the Knights took on the newest, biggest capitalist on the block, Jay Gould. Since the death of Tom Scott, Jay Gould had risen to be the railroad owner everyone loved to hate. In 1885, Gould announced that he would cut wages for the workers on his Southwest Railroad Company. The Knights threatened to strike, and Gould was forced not to go through with the wage cuts. This made the Knights heroes of sorts among the working class, and their membership numbers steadily increased. However, Gould had another trick up his sleeve. A year later, in 1886, Gould announced that he would in fact be cutting wages to the most unskilled workers on his railroads, the ones he could easily replace if they went out on strike. It was a trap designed to see if the Knights would stand behind their most vulnerable members. Powderly fell right into the trap, encouraging his members not to strike and therefore abandoning the unskilled workers. However, Knights of Labor members did not listen to Powderly and went out on strike anyway. It proved that, while the Knights of Labor were popular, they were unable to control their members. Gould had a full-fledged revolt on his hands, and he had a plan to counteract it. He remembered how slow the federal government was in 1877 to send soldiers. While President Hayes did end up using federal troops, they often arrived too late to prevent most of the destruction. However, if workers went on strike against the federal government, they would come out much faster to stop it. To that end, Gould declared bankruptcy for his Southwest Railroad Company. Going into bankruptcy made the Southwest Company the property of the federal government. This meant the striking workers were now striking against the feds, and soldiers could be sent out to crush them. This tactic would be used by other capitalists too. For those who did not want to go through the bankruptcy process, they can go to the courts and have judges file injunctions declaring strikes illegal. In many cases, these judges were friends of the capitalists, put on the court by politicians who were bought off by the capitalists. The wealthy classes had learned their lesson by the 1880s. However, as we have seen, railroad strikes had a way of spreading across the country, and this one was no different. Gould had gotten the government to break the strike in the Southwest, but not before it metastasized along the rail lines and spread to the center of the entire system, Chicago. Everything was bigger in Chicago. The number of workers, the number of unions, the number of immigrants, and the revolutionary ideas from Europe. There were plenty of communists, particularly anarcho-communists, who wanted to get rid of the capitalist class and the government altogether. In May 1886, railroad workers coordinated with workers in other industries to organize a protest for an 8-hour workday. Gould had already gotten the courts to issue injunctions declaring these protests illegal. Terence Powderly of the Knights of Labor tried to encourage the workers in Chicago to knock it off, but it was too late. On May 3rd, Chicago police, along with Pinkerton agents, clashed with workers at the McCormick Reaper factory. 6 workers were killed. An anarchist named August Spies printed up a newspaper calling for workers of Chicago to arm themselves. They met in bars across the city and drew up plans to attack police stations. The business leaders of Chicago bought a machine gun for the Chicago police. When it was clear that the cops were not backing down, Spies called instead for a peaceful protest at Haymarket Square on May 4th. Spies was disappointed by how few people came out to Haymarket Square. 3,000 workers at most. He, along with other anarchists, gave speeches into the night as the crowd got smaller and smaller. The Haymarket Square protest was totally peaceful. However, one of the last speakers, Samuel Fielden, said that the laws and injunctions of the federal government were written by the capitalist class. In his words, workers should throttle it, kill it, stop it. This was violent enough for the Chicago police, and they started to break up the protest. At that moment, a bomb was thrown from the crowd into the police. Police responded by firing into the crowd. 5 workers and 7 police were killed. Dozens more were injured. Chicago's newspapers had a field day with the events at Haymarket Square. They labeled the workers as terrorists bent on class rebellion. August Spies and other leaders were rounded up and put on trial. The government tried all of the leaders as a group, so that crimes one of the people were accused of could be applied to all of them. 4 of them, including Spies, were executed. 25,000 people came out to march in their funeral procession. John Brown Jr. sent them a letter before their deaths, where he quoted his father, "It is a great comfort to feel assured that I am permitted to die for a cause, not merely to pay the debt of nature, as all must." The Haymarket Square leaders were seen as martyrs by a good part of the working class, but not by Terence Powderly. Powderly denounced anarchy and violent rebellion, distancing himself from the condemned leaders. When nights workers tried to continue to strike for an 8-hour day, he threatened to kick them out of the organization. Many workers started to view Powderly as a soft sellout, a liberal who valued the comfort of an unjust system rather than a leader who wanted actual change. This was the beginning of the end of the Knights of Labor. Workers abandoned them in droves. At the same time, the government's prosecution of anarchists neutralized many of their most able organizers. Newspaper reports tried to tie the Knights to the violence at Haymarket Square. They lost the support of their workers while also being attacked by the capitalist class as dangerous troublemakers. They couldn't find allies anywhere. Haymarket Square was a major turning point in the history of American labor. It showed that capitalists and the government would stop at nothing to destroy any movement that even had a whiff of communism or anarchy. It showed that organizations like the Knights of Labor, who tried to unite everyone, were too large and unwieldy to control or organize. Most importantly, it demonstrated once and for all that the ideal of free labor was dead. Workers would not be allowed any control over their conditions. The only thing they could hope to achieve was to convince corporations to pay decent wages. Wage labor, what was once considered a temporary stop on the road to success, became permanent. Capitalists would exercise total control over conditions and profits. The unions who would dominate the generation of workers after the Knights of Labor accepted these circumstances. The American Federation of Labor, the AFL, consisted of skilled workers who used strikes as leverage, since skilled workers were not so easily replaced. They could demand better wages without threatening the capitalist control over conditions or the means of production. Furthermore, representing skilled workers meant the AFL would have less immigrants in their ranks, and presumably less communists and anarchists. This would make them less threatening, so that the government would not be tempted to call in the police or the militia to crack some heads. They represented the respectable part of the working class, the aristocracy of labor, the ones who didn't rock the boat too much. It is no surprise that unions like the AFL still operate today, while the others have been relegated to the dustbin of history. Today, we consider the wage system and capitalism as something as natural as the sun rising in the morning. It is tough for people to imagine an alternative, but most Americans, no matter their politics, know that something is deeply wrong with the system we have. The country's reaction to Luigi Mangione demonstrates this. Our problem lies with our inability to imagine a solution. Democrats offer small changes that don't fundamentally threaten the system. Republicans certainly don't threaten the system either. and lead people to think racism and misogyny are the answers to boot. People like Bernie Sanders, with clear ideas for change, are attacked by both sides as a socialist, even though most socialists don't see Bernie as socialist enough. Looking to what the workers of the late 1800s wanted, and what they considered to be viable alternatives, might be a good starting point for us today. Sure, the world is much different now than it was back then, but history is an endless store of valuable lessons we can try to apply to our current circumstances. Is it natural for people to work for wages? Is it natural for a small class of business owners to control the vast resources of a country? Is it natural for us to accept the fact that this is just how the real world works? If the answer to these questions is no, then what would be a better, more sustainable way of doing things?
That any time capital seeks to dominate labor, there'll be a ruthless, uncompromising struggle on the part of labor until it comes to crush capital and dominate it. This is a fact. My history demonstrates that. We came here as chattel slaves for centuries. We fought and fought and fought until we crushed it. Now we're just slave of the wage, and now we've got to rise up and crush that one. That's to declare that Karl Marx didn't invent socialism. It's there for all to see. Karl Marx's great contribution to the world was in the area of historical materialism and dialectical materialism, something you need to know if you know about socialism. But since you don't know about socialism, you don't even know the words. And not only does the enemy keep you ignorant, you stay ignorant. You won't ever go read a book about socialism. Why read a book about socialism? They already told me in my class it ain't no good. You will not even read a book about socialism. Why, you don't even read a book about your history. We come to inspire you to learn. We come to tell you that when you come to serve a people, you must know as much as you can. The more you know, the better able you are to serve the people.